Today we get to hear from Brad Monson, an instructor in the College of Business. Brad teaches the business law classes in the College of Business, which is a required course for most of our business students. And he has a great idea of integrating the Daniels Fund Ethics Initiative principles into this course using an ethics case or examples. So we will explore with Brad this question of, if it's legal, is it ethical?
Thank you, Tracy. Good morning. It's wonderful to be here. Grateful for you joining us on a Friday morning. Thankful to Tracy and the Daniels Fund for hosting these roundtables, and look forward to sharing some experiences from business law, as Tracy just mentioned, and hopefully starting a discussion and getting your own input and your own experiences as we go. As Tracy just mentioned, I teach business law. I'm in my third year of full-time teaching at UCCS. Prior to that, I practiced law full-time, and I taught for a year as an adjunct lecturer. And I'm happy to be an ethics fellow this year. As I thought about a project to more fully integrate ethics into the business law curriculum, my mind went back to my days as an undergraduate business student. I studied accounting in the years following the Enron accounting scandal, where, as you know, investors lost a lot of money. Executives went to prison. One of the largest accounting firms in the world went under due to the ethical and legal failings of a relative few. The Sarbanes-Oxley Act was passed, and the public accounting industry in general faced heavy scrutiny and reforms. So ethics were front and center in our accounting studies, as I'm sure they were in accounting programs nationwide, and as they still are. As part of our ethics studies in my undergraduate program, one of our assigned readings was this book that I'm holding. It's called Winners Never Cheat. It's by John Huntsman Sr., who was a successful business person and a vocal, strong proponent of business ethics, much like Bill Daniels, I believe. And if you asked me today to summarize this book, I could tell you some general concepts from it, but I wouldn't be able to tell you a lot of specifics from this book, except for a single story that I recall reading that I still vividly remember and stands out in my mind. The story comes from the year 1986, where Mr. Huntsman was in negotiations with the CEO of Great Lakes Chemical Company to sell 40% of a division of one of his companies. And there were long negotiations, and ultimately they settled on a handshake deal for a sales price of $54 million by Great Lakes Chemical Company in exchange for 40% of Mr. Huntsman's company. Well, following this handshake deal, there was some delay in getting the lawyers to draft the paperwork, to draft the documents to memorialize the transaction. So actually 6.5 months went by, and they still didn't have a written agreement. I'm going to read from the chapter here now. He said, quote, "In the interim, the price of raw materials had decreased substantially, and our profit margins were reaching all-time highs. Profits had tripled in that half a year. Nothing had been signed with Great Lakes, and no documents had been exchanged. Campen, who was the opposite CEO of Great Lakes, called with a remarkable proposal. 40% of Huntsman Chemical today is worth $250 million, according to my bankers," said Campen. "You and I shook hands and agreed on a $54 million price over 6 months ago. Although he did not think he should have to pay the full difference, he thought it only fair he pay at least half and offered to do so. My answer was no. It would not be fair to use the appreciated value, nor should he have to split the difference. He and I shook hands and made an agreement at $54 million, I said, and that's exactly the price at which the attorneys would draft our documents. But that's not fair to you, Campen responded. You negotiate for your company, Emerson, and let me negotiate for mine, was my response. That story, after all these years, 15 years ago, I read this as an accounting student, and it stayed with me. And we take a lot of lessons from this story that can be applied to many different contexts. If Mr. Huntsman's integrity was not for sale at $200 million, I think we can safely assume it was not for sale at any price. And regarding this experience, there on your screen, Mr. Huntsman related, even though I could have forced Great Lakes to pay an extra $200 million for that 40% ownership stake in my company, I never had to wrestle with my conscience or to look over my shoulder. My word was my bond. So we can relate this to a number of Daniels Fund Ethics Initiative principles, such as integrity and trust, fairness, respect. But as I thought about this story 15 years ago, the way it stayed with me out of many pages in this book, it made me consider the power of examples in our learning. And so I jotted down a really informal list on what benefits are there to examples in our learning. How do examples help us? The first thought I had was that examples are memorable. They help with learning retention. Stories seem to stay with us. In the legal context, it may be easier to remember a story than a statute. Another useful another useful aspect of examples are they bring clarity to complex topics. In law school, one of the primary methods of learning is studying court opinions and reading case examples on how the law was applied to a particular set of facts. So examples bring clarity to the topics that we're learning. Examples also provide models for future decision-making. In the legal system, when a court is called upon to decide a case, it will look to past precedents. It'll find case examples that have similar or analogous facts to determine how the law should be applied in the current case. In the ethical example that we just read, we can draw many lessons to guide our future decisions. We may not be a party to a multi-million-dollar stock transaction, but the lessons we take from this example can guide our conduct in our own dealings and in the way that we treat others, our customers, our business partners, our employers, our employees, and so on. And these lessons can be replicated and applied to many situations. And this leads to the last point. Examples provide an efficient mode of learning. We can take many lessons from a single example. In that example we just read, we learned lessons of honesty, fairness, respect, transparency, all bundled into a single example. In our business law class, one of the concepts that we discuss from our textbook chapter, the textbook is Business Law Today by Roger Miller. One of the key concepts is here on your screen. Business persons must remember that an action that is legal is not necessarily ethical. We spend a lot of time in our class studying the law and studying behavior that can lead to criminal or civil liability. And we talk about how to avoid legal liability. But we need to remember that an action is not necessarily ethical simply because you will not be prosecuted for it or not face a lawsuit for it. Continuing, the chapter says, quote, compliance with the law is sometimes called the moral minimum. If people and entities merely comply with the law, they are acting at the lowest ethical level that society will tolerate, end quote. This concept fits well with the Daniels Fund Ethics Initiative principles. One of those principles is called rule of law, and it's devoted to compliance with the spirit and intent of laws and regulations. And certainly this is important for all of us and our students to understand. But we're also trying to instill something greater in our students. We want future leaders who are ethical and successful. Bill Daniels called ethical behavior the ultimate business advantage. And we want our students to go into the workforce and go forward with their lives, having this ultimate business advantage. And there's a story, another example from the life of Bill Daniels that I think illustrates these ethical concepts from our textbook chapter. This example is published on the Daniels Fund website. It reads, quote, in 1952, Bill opened a small insurance agency in Casper, Wyoming, and struggled to make it over the next 3 years. Bill recalled that in 1955, one of the insurance companies I represented went broke. 2 weeks after their bankruptcy, one of my clients to whom I had sold a liability policy was sued by Burlington Railroad. A judgment was entered against my client for $11,000. I made a deal with Burlington to pay this judgment off at $500 per month over a 22-month period. I did not have to do this, but I had a strong conviction that I owed this to my insured, who had placed his faith in my handling of his insurance business. During this time, the $500 payment was more than I was making per month. I managed, however, through borrowing and juggling finances to do this, end quote. So Mr. Daniels here, in this example, he went beyond the legal minimum. He was not the insurance carrier himself, and he apparently had no legal obligation to pay this judgment on behalf of his client. But he still felt an ethical imperative. He felt an obligation to his client to cover this judgment for them. And so he borrowed and he sacrificed and he scraped to pay off this judgment for his client. And in so doing, he secured for himself what he referred to as the ultimate business advantage. And we know that he went on to have a very successful career with that advantage. So for my business law students, I wanted to harness the power of examples. And I had a couple goals with the business ethics case assignment. I wanted students to research and find their own example of business ethics, one that would hopefully stay with them for the next 15 years and beyond, something that'd be meaningful to them. My second goal was for the students to spend some time with the Daniels Fund Ethics Initiative principles, to get familiar with them and to practice applying them to a real-world situation. We see these principles hanging in our classrooms at UCCS and Dwyer Hall. And again, I wanted them to pause and to think about how they may apply to a real-world situation. So the assignment for the students was to research a business decision that had ethical implications, and then to do a simple write-up of that business decision and connect it to one or more of the Daniels Fund Ethics Initiative principles, and to submit that. As I read these students' submissions, it was wonderful. They took the time to read and digest these principles and analyze and apply them to a real-world scenario. As just a few examples, one student wrote about CVS Pharmacy and the decision by CVS Pharmacy a few years ago to stop the sale of cigarette and tobacco products to their customers. They had generated significant revenue from the sale of cigarette and tobacco products, but they felt that They could more fully align with their mission as a health company by ceasing such sales. So the student wrote up that decision and connected that decision to DFEI principles of trust in stakeholder relationships, building trust with their customers and the health of their customers. They connected it to transparency, where they released statistics on their sale of tobacco and were open with the public and with their customers on why they were ceasing the sale of these products. They also connected it to the principle of viability, contributing to the health of their relevant stakeholders, their customers. And they contributed in other ways as well through donations to the American Lung Association and the Campaign for Tobacco-Free Kids. So they connected it to that principle of viability. Another student wrote about a technology company and the company's response to customer data vulnerabilities. This company received a tip from an outside security researcher who discovered a vulnerability in their customer information database. And this company immediately took steps to fix the issue and then issued a public statement directed at their customers about the vulnerabilities that had taken place and which information had been exposed, which information had not been exposed. Fortunately, passwords and credit card information had not been exposed, but they were transparent and open with their customers about what had transpired. So this student was impressed with the company's reactions, their response, and connected it to these ethical principles of transparency, accountability, trust with their customer base, and respect for their customers. Another student wrote about Johnson & Johnson's actions surrounding the Tylenol recall in 1982, where there were cases of cyanide poisoning that were traced back to Tylenol products. And immediately there was a recall of 31 million bottles of Tylenol. Johnson & Johnson immediately implemented that recall. They provided warnings and updates to their customers and the public. They introduced tamper-proof bottling to prevent these occurrences from happening again. They established a hotline to address customer questions and concerns. So this student was impressed with Johnson & Johnson's actions and connected it to the ethical principles of integrity, accountability, and transparency with their customers. Some students wrote about negative ethical examples as well. Some students wrote about, again, the Enron accounting scandal and connected that scandal to ethical principles of, well, a failure of integrity, failure to act with honesty in all situations, a lack of accountability, a lack of transparency, failure to maintain open and truthful communications in public filings and in accounting reports. Another student wrote about the Bernie Madoff investment scandal, the largest Ponzi scheme in history, and connected that Ponzi scheme to each one of the DFEI principles and how each of these ethical principles were missing. So again, it was wonderful to read the student submissions and to see them analyzing these DFEI principles and connecting them to real world scenarios. As educators, we want our students to succeed. We want to provide them with every honest and ethical advantage possible as they prepare for their future careers and their life's work. And Mr. Daniels called ethical behavior the ultimate business advantage. So that's my report on the business ethics case from my business law class. I'd like to open it up to any of your experiences in your classes, or if you have any comments or feedback to share, we would love to hear that.
Brad?
Yes.
How did it, can you explain a little more about how you had them align the ethics bullets to the examples?
Yeah, so the write-up, it was a simple write-up, and I just asked them to, I left it pretty broad for the students. I just asked them to describe what ethics example they had found, whether positive or negative, and then just do a write-up over a page or two about how that example connected to one or more of these principles. So nothing terribly complex, but hopefully it met the goal of getting them to sit down and read through these and think about how they connect to a real world scenario.
You didn't have the issue of a student taking one, like integrity, and applying it to all his examples, did you? Did you require them to mix it up a little?
I don't think I came across that, but I did leave it pretty broad in their court as to how many they wanted to connect it to. Most people picked several, some picked all. It was pretty open-ended on their side.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Hey, Brad, I have a question. This is Tracy.
Yes. Hi.
You did a great example of explanation of the Daniels Fund Ethics Initiative principles. Is that what you use in your class to introduce the topic?
Yeah, it was part of the lecture for that chapter on business ethics. That's right. It was introduced to the students, and yeah, it was conveyed to them in the lecture.
And for those that we do have people from other schools joining us today, could you provide kind of a description of the students that are in the business law class that you do this?
Sure, yeah. It's a 2000 level class, so usually they're pretty early in their business studies. A lot of sophomores in there. Yeah, so again, 2000 level class, pretty early in their business college career.
Okay, I'd like to open it up to the audience to talk about how maybe this could apply for their classes. If we could have that discussion, I think that would be good.
Well, Brad, if I may, I really enjoyed your presentation. Thank you very much. One of the things that I really enjoy was the fact that you mentioned that just because something is legal does not mean that it's ethical. And that's how I always start my discussion about ethics in my classroom. So I show the little square with the quadrants. You have legal, unethical, then unethical and illegal, and then and I go through the whole thing. And I always get a little pushback from the students saying, "No, hold on. If it's legal, it has to be ethical." I said, "Not really." So we go through the whole thing about how sometimes, unfortunately, the legal system lags behind changes in society values or beliefs, and therefore some stuff may be perceived as legal, but it's unethical. And I really enjoy the fact that the whole thing about the stories, because I agree with you. The best way to actually get students really engaged is through the power of stories. That's something that I have noticed a long time ago. I mean, our brains are wired for that anyways. So just the whole legal thing was something, on the stories was something that really caught my attention. And I'm definitely gonna, use your example from that Winners Never Cheat book. So I'll definitely use that example as well to open up my ethical discussion in my principles marketing class. So thank you for sharing that. It was pretty great.
Thank you, Juan. I appreciate that.
I would like to say that I think this is a great idea. I teach an introduction to freshman engineering class, introduction to engineering for freshman class. And typically I provide them an example up front and have everyone write about the same topic. I think this is a good way to get the students more motivated. And but I can see the downside is it would require more effort on our part to be flexible, to have more grading to do. Can you speak a little bit to that, how you handle all these different topics and grading equally?
Yeah. Yeah, there was a grading grid. There were points for identifying the ethical example, step one. There were points for applying it to the Daniels Fund Ethics Initiative principles. And there were a lot of papers to read through and grade. It was gratifying to go through those, and enjoyable to read about what they found, and again, hopefully with the goal that they found something that's going to apply to their careers and apply to their lives, and hopefully remain with them long past this class is over. Yeah.
Would you be willing to share that rubric with us?
Yeah, I can share that.
That'd be.
Yeah, I'd be happy to share that.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Hi, Brad. This is Warren Munich from Pikes Peak Community College. I teach economics and entrepreneurship there. Thank you so much for your presentation today. I love the title of your presentation. I guess that's sort of the effort that all of us take in front of the classroom as well. Yeah? One of the things that I do in my classes is to have students identify businesses, both for-profit and not-for-profit, in the community, and break that company down into its mission and vision and how they make a difference in our community. And one of the things that comes up, while on the surface it doesn't appear that any one of these companies is doing anything unethical or illegal, I have students think in the broader realm of what's the right thing to do. So even though companies and small businesses are hiring people and employing people and helping them put food on the table, which is righteous, we have to ask maybe sometimes the bigger question about, is it right that employees aren't making minimum wage or making a living wage? Is it right that if you're in the housing industry or you're a real estate agent, while you may not be doing anything unethical, in the broader realm, I have to ask, is it right that we have an affordable housing crisis? Or if you're in public education, is it right that we haven't distributed our tax dollars so that all children have access to quality, affordable neighborhoods, which creates the public education system? So how do you differentiate, or how do you raise the level of discussion from microeconomics to macro? Or do you?
One of the things I really appreciate about these ethics initiative principles are they give us guideposts. If there's a legal question that comes across our desk, we know exactly where to look. We can look up a statute, look up a constitutional provision, we can look up case law and study how those facts would be applied, how the law would be applied to those facts by a court. We can look to regulatory law. We know exactly where to go to find what the law is on a particular question. And I appreciate the Daniels Fund Ethics Initiative principles because they give us these guideposts. They give us a place to look when we have to make complex questions. We have to answer complex questions that may not have simple solutions. We have guideposts, and if we can fit any kind of ethical question into these within this framework, then we know that we're off to a good start, and it can guide us to an ethical outcome.
Is it fair to politicize a case study and reach out into your student population and question the political difference and use the principle, the idea of creating value in our communities, or creating internal and external value? Kind of raises the question, we need to look beyond our own backyard. We need to look beyond our own individual business protocols to think about how money governs the really necessary things in life, like healthcare, education, and public services like that.
Yeah, and there were
Let's do it.
Oh, I think there were some different political views that I think emerged in this case assignment, and I kept it more broad focused here on the ethical principles. I wasn't really trying to steer that conversation so much, other than to have students apply the principles in the way that they thought best to a particular business decision.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Thank you.
Appreciate
that.
Mm-hmm.
Mr. Monson?
Yes.
Sorry, I'm talking through a mask. Can you hear me okay?
I can, yes.
Okay. I have a quick question for you. I just graduated law school actually in the spring. I just got my law degree in May.
Congratulations.
And I think, thank you so much. Yeah, it's good to be done with that. I will not miss, yeah. But honestly, I studied constitutional law, more specifically the First Amendment. There were all sorts of thorny moral and ethical issues there. When to allow speech, I remember being presented with the question of whether or not it was okay to let white supremacists practice law. When do we start, where do we draw the line? And law is full of those tricky issues. And I think it's so easy to draw, to just state what the law is and not actually apply it. And I think that's why cases come in so useful. And I think that's what you're talking about today and what you're having your students do is so useful. My question though is, building off Professor Munich's, so much of today's, there are questions about what is going on in our legal system that I think we are not going to get the type of ethical results that we want coming out of our legal system, considering the deference that is being given. It's almost a return to the Lochner era. So can we teach our students in a way that says, just because this is legal, we know that trading on congressional knowledge was legal prior to the passage of the Stock Act, and I believe 2012, just because this is legal, can we effectively say, long-term, it benefits you to more thoroughly engage in ethical behaviors because it leads to long-term success, versus if you're engaging in unethical behaviors like Arthur Andersen and Enron did, it leads to the short-term success but long-term dissolution of the company.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. I appreciate you bringing that up. Certainly, there's hopefully overlap between what the laws and what ethics would require, but there may not be perfect overlap all the time. And so that's why I think it's so important to instill these ethical values into the students as best as we can, so that they're guided by, again, something, certainly the law, but also something greater than the law. So yeah, I appreciate you bringing that up.
And can I just follow it up with another question if you have time?
Sure.
So I think in the past, there's been a tendency to teach what the law is and not what it should be. Do you believe that there's a trend in business law professors to go more towards talking about the reasons behind the law as opposed to just its practical applications?
We do. There's certainly room for discussion on that, and we do talk about policy reasons behind laws and the reasons and that laws developed the way they did. There's also, from a practical standpoint, there's a lot of material to get through, and for a lot of students, it's their first exposure to the law. For most students, it's their first legal class. So there is a lot of studying what the law is, but there's also discussions on policies behind laws that I think you're alluding to, and why the law developed the way that it did.
Perfect. I appreciate you answering my questions. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Hi, Brad. Could I jump in?
Thank you.
Sorry, I can't have my video on right now.
No
but
problem.
It sounds like you can hear me. So I'm Jen Kling, and I teach philosophy at UCCS, actually. And I really enjoyed your presentation because I actually teach philosophy of law. And so I was just sort of sitting here going like, yes, this sounds really good.
Wonderful.
So I was wondering if when you do this with your students, you get into sort of more complicated examples at all, right? Because one of the things that comes up in philosophy of law a lot of the time, right, is are these kinds of cases where following rule of law is going to cause like viability problems, right? Or sort of transparent, like trying to follow sort of the principle of transparency, right? Occasionally goes against sort of national security interests, right? And legal procedures. And so I just was wondering, like, how far do you go with the use of examples? Do you start to get into some of these more complex issues?
Yeah, no, I appreciate that question. And kind of going back to what I said a second ago, there are practical constraints here. We have a lot to get through in one semester. We get through contract law, employment law, bankruptcy law, business entity law. There's a lot to cover. Property law, securities law. We have a lot of practical time constraints, and it's not purely it's not a legal philosophy class. Not to downplay that importance at all. So yeah, we do get into some of that a little bit, but mostly I think for time constraints, practical constraints, maybe we don't go as deep as you were just describing on all the angles that we could develop in these areas with the philosophy of law.
No, thanks. That's really helpful, right? Because I was actually asking because I struggle with it in my own classes, right? Because you always want to go deep, but then at the same time you're like, I have so much stuff to cover.
That's exactly the way it is. Yeah.
Yeah. No, thank you.
Thank you.
Hey, Brad, this is Dan Likens.
Hello.
And I teach at UCCS. I do human physiology, human anatomy, that sort of thing. And I just want to say, wow. Tracy asked, how can this be used in our classes? And I have the same problem that you and Jen and everyone else have, which is way more content that we want to deliver than we have time available. And so I'm looking ahead to fall of 2021, and I may have the opportunity to take on a new course. And so I'll get to do some new course design. And what a cool way that you've done this. And so I want to give you a kudos. Just directly inserting the ethics initiative principles, which is what I look at the Daniels Fund Ethics Initiative, I say, wow, this is the core of it. And to give that meat directly into your students, that's just amazing in itself. So kudos to you. I sometimes am critiqued for communicating too correctly, but I appreciate your directness. Look, here's the principles, work with them. That's simple and brilliant. So I would have to categorize that as elegant. So kudos to you for doing that and then making an example of it to us by teaching us. So thank you.
Thank you.
I also want to say kind of an aha that has occurred through the course of my varied career. I used to be in the military, and I taught at the Air Force Academy for a while. And while I was there, the Air Force adopted something they call the Air Force Core Principles. And there are 3 core principles, and they are service before self, integrity first, and it was integrity first, service before self, and excellence in all we do. And with no real grand high-level instruction, they were just adopted, promulgated, and then we had to teach them to our students and unpack them. So we had to do a lot of thinking about them. And so I was at this point quite a ways into my career, and I'm just excited to hear you say that in this first course for business students regarding law, that you unpack what was really a big aha for me, which is that legal compliance is a moral minimum. And so I had come to the conclusion, the way I state and explain excellence in all we do, is that excellence is a commitment to exceeding standards, is a commitment to going beyond the minimum amount that's required. And so seeing that you in this entirely different field have hit on the exact same thought, or the author of your textbook that's hopefully widely used, it's in the 15th edition, I think you said, that's awesome. That this Daniels Ethics Fund concept is not just here and there. It's in a lot of places, and we're coming at it from different ways with our students. So that was just really exciting to me. So I want to thank you for your example of how you put this directly in your course, Brad. It's really well done.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Kayla Petty she is a pre-law student, by the way. So she asked, I am curious to know to what extent most case studies address a factor of the DFEI principles. Do you find that the DFI principles are generally all encompassing, or do you find that there are more general principles that cases violate?
Good question. I think just going off the experience from this semester, which was the first time I'd introduced this case study, I think the students were able, I think the DFEI principles were broad enough to apply to every ethical scenario that at least was written about for this assignment. So I don't think students had any trouble finding one and usually more principles to connect to all the scenarios that they found.
Was there one principle that they seemed to almost always use?
Integrity seemed to be a universal. That came up just about every time. I think just going off memory, I think that was probably the most common one, but accountability, transparency, trust came in a lot as well.
Just, Brad, thank you very much. This is Michael from Western, and thank you very much for your presentation. I teach international business, and you can imagine that there are a lot of discussions for the students between what is legal and ethical in the US versus in other countries. And the approach that we should take, whether we should be moralists in that sense, or should we adapt to what the Romans do when we are in Rome. Do you have any cases that support that? Or do you use any cases, especially in this international setting, obviously where laws are different, where perspectives of what's ethical and unethical can change dramatically?
Yeah, great question. Off the top of my head, I don't have one that would apply to the scenario you just raised. I know I could find one and be happy to be in communication with you on that. Well, off the top of my head, nothing. I don't have one right at my fingertips.
Yeah. Okay. No. I just thank you.
No, thank you.
Hi, Brad. My name's April. I teach at Pikes Peak. I teach cybersecurity.
Hello.
And I appreciate all of your examples and how you integrate them in class, because the concepts that I teach in primarily my entry-level class, which is also, it covers like 17 different categories of cybersecurity. And we teach how to hack things, which is the illegal part, but you have to know how to do that to protect your resources. And so it's helpful to have examples of, is this a good example or a bad example, and how to, apply it to each situation, because like you said, each situation has pros and cons, and you have to sort out what the ethical part is or isn't. And it's hard to pack that in with all the other stuff that we do. So I appreciate your presentation and kind of bringing that around about having examples and discussing the examples. I don't have a lot of my own business experience in penetration testing or security situations, but if I can find a book or find examples, then I can create discussion about it. So
thank you.
Hi, so Brad, I'm Ryan Aker. I work in disability services here at UCCS. I'm an accommodation coordinator, and I just wanted to, it's more of a comment. I just wanted to say I really like I think Dan Likens brought this up, the moral minimum quote that you gave. Compliance with the law is sometimes called the moral minimum. And a big part of our job as disability services is to think about what the Office of Civil Rights would say, when it comes to accommodations and just applying them in the classroom, and the integrity of the class and the class structure and things like that. And so it's interesting because a lot of times when we have to push for even maybe physical space, I can use as an example, in a building where there are office suites, and maybe the physical space isn't big enough, for someone with a powered wheelchair or something like that. And so, but it still meets the minimum, right? And so I find that just across the board, when it comes to disability services, this just really spoke to me, because a lot of the times we're meeting the moral minimum when it comes to, well, there's OCR, what are they going to say? I think we can get away with doing this or not doing that. And so that sometimes really feeds into decision making just across the board in physical and mental spaces.
Thank you, Ryan.
Sure.
I appreciate that.
Okay, well, if we're no more comments, we will have a recording of this posted. So I want to thank everyone for attending, and also I'm sure that Brad will share the PowerPoint slides as well. And I did ask him if he could provide also, and we can send it to everybody in the follow-up email, the instructions that he uses for this assignment and maybe the grading rubric, because I think that will help everybody. Thank you very much for participation. It was a great discussion, and I hope that I see you in the spring